in collaboration with the Department of English, Egra Sarodas Education College. Today is 21st June, and it is the 5th day of the 10 days series of online lectures starting on and from 17th June 2020. It is also the 6th consecutive lecture of our lecture series. Today, we have got among us one of such speakers who is not only a good speaker, but also very well known to all of us. His popularity as a resource person in seminars and conferences for present days is noteworthy. He is Dr. Amrit Sen, professor and head, Department of English and other modern European languages, Visva University. The topic of his today's lecture, the beautiful oblique, reading Tritram Shandy. Dr. Sen is an academician feeling interest in 18th century studies, travel writing, Tagore studies, history of science, and many others. He has won the Outstanding Research Award for his doctoral dissertation, The Narcissistic Mode, Metafiction as a Strategy in Mole Flanders, Tom Jones, and Tritram Shandy, published by Worldview in 2007. He has also bagged a UGC Research Award for his project, The Self and the World in Tagore's Travel Writings. His list of publications indeed is quite long, both as a single author and as a co-editor. Besides, he has contributed a lot of articles to the journals at national level and at international level. We have such an outstanding speaker for present lecture. I would request Dr. Amrit Sen to start his deliberation. Dr. Sen.
Thank you, and a very good morning to you, Aloy Babu. I still remember with great fondness our interactions at Egra College. Thank you to the organizers at Kharagpur College also. Kharagpur happens to be a college of one of my very dear friends, Kaushik from Shantiniketan, who I interacted with in a refresher course. It was indeed refreshing at Bardhaman University. But I just like to ask you whether you can see my screen now. Can you?
Okay, the screen is being seen.
Right. Okay. So here goes my lecture on what is probably my most favorite novel. And as I can see, a lot of my students have joined my deliberation here, and they will remember the fondness and savor with which I really sort of discuss this novel. A novel which Victor Shklovsky once called the most typical of all novels, and why he calls it is something which I will come to in a moment. But I've titled this The Beautiful Oblique, reading Tritram Shandy. And please note that title once, because the title is the gateway into the entry for reading Sterne really. As you can see, this is the poster that had been put out by Kharagpur College and Egra College. And when Jayanto Babu had asked me, what is the title of your lecture, I'd said The Beautiful Oblique. And look at the oblique here, the beautiful oblique. It's not, I do not mean to criticize him. It's in fact the magic of Sterne really operating, I would say, in that poster, because between the word and the print lies a slippage. And between the word and the meaning lies a slippage. And Sterne is one of the very, very first novelists to question this gap between the word and the meaning. So there's a perpetual slip, there's a perpetual play within Sterne, which sort of looks at, interrogates critically how language functions and how there is always a gap between the signifier and the signified, and what it does to a literary text and what it does to literary meaning. And that is the precise point which becomes my gateway into the understanding of Tristram Shandy as a text. So it's fanciful, isn't it, that the poster was almost a prelude to what I had intended to discuss. So thank you for putting out that poster. Now, Sterne's Tristram Shandy was published 1760 and was published in 9 volumes between 1760 and 1767 and 79. The last volume actually came out after Sterne had passed away the age of 55. Sterne was, of course, fighting tuberculosis, the nemesis of many of the authors of that period, and he was greatly taken down with sciatica, another painful, debilitating disease. Sterne, you must remember, was also a pastor, so he was a religious, a clergyman. I'll show you the church which I had visited where Sterne used to preach. And the last 2 books, of course, of Tristram Shandy were written under the shadow of his impending death. So that is the history of composition. It was not written at one go. It was a book which was, spread across a lot of time, as it were, and written, different parts of it were written at different random times. Now, I would suggest that, if 1740 marks the birth, of the novel, that's Pamela, which we recognize as the first really established novel in England, 1740. Then within 20 years, Sterne is publishing this in 1760, that the novel had established its codes of realism, and Sterne was deconstructing these modes. And what was, and why does one read Tristram Shandy, and why is it a book that speaks to us in this postmodern age? Because of the challenges that it throws up, and the challenges that it throws up to the Enlightenment in general, the book in particular, and the concept of the novel in great particular. So here are the challenges that I'm going to explore that Tristram Shandy throws up to the notion of plot, to the notion of the book as you know it, to the ideas of Locke and Hume, which were the dominant and sweeping ideas of the period, to the notions of sexuality. And Sterne, remember, being a pastor, is playing around with these notions. And of course, to the notions of language, which is a fundamental postmodern paradox that Sterne looks at. But here is the man. This is Lawrence Sterne by Joshua Reynolds, and look at the playful nature of the man who's wearing the pastoral robe. And you can see Sterne, as it were, thinking of how to, make a little bit of more mischief with the form. But let me tell you that he was a deadly serious man when it came to exploring the form of the novel. And here is one of the first pictures of Shandy Hall, in which this entire Tristram Shandy takes place. Let me give you a brief description. This is a village in Coxwell. There's no Shandy Hall, as it were. It's the cottage where Sterne lived in the last days of his life. This is in the village of Coxwell in Yorkshire. And it's a village which you can reach by bus even now. From the station of York, there are 3 buses in the day. So if you want to reach Coxwell, it's a very difficult place to go by. By the way, Coxwell was also the village where, in the graveyard, Oliver Cromwell is buried. So it's a village with a lot of history, as it were. This is a picture of Shandy Hall. This is a picture of Shandy Hall taken from the back. And this is the bowling green in which, as it were, Toby places his fortifications, and therefore becomes very crucial in the novel. This is, of course, the parlor at Shandy Hall presently. It's a museum dedicated to Sterne. And you can see, if my cursor is moving here properly, the fireplace before which Walter Shandy would have, sat and philosophized on the Philosophus Gloriosus and the name that he would give to his young son. The fireplace once again. And so I'm trying to actually visualize the place in which Sterne would be sort of writing this novel, the modes and the models through which these would be articulated. Am I audible? Am I audible?
Yes, sir.
Yes, yes,
Yes,
yes.
sir. You are
I'm,
audible.
I'm
Clear.
sorry. I'm sorry. And this, of course, is the Coxwell Church where Sterne would have preached. But now notice this, because this was scandalizing for a lot of people in the 18th century, that a preacher like Sterne could engage in such a bawdy, naughty, in fact, Thackeray would call it dirty little book, like Tristram Shandy. So sexuality is central to the novel. And why is it central to the novel is a question that I'll try and answer somewhat in this discussion. But let me once again get back to this notion of game and play, which incidentally is something which is very a favorite of mine, because you must understand that, the theory of game and play is central to our process of reading. And this is something which I've also talked about whenever I talk about the detective novel. If you take the game of Ludo, for example, which all of us play, and which is really, in a certain way, the bare stripped essence of the game. You see, the game will have essentially 6 features, as Lanham points out. You have to have 2 players, although you can play the game of patience alone. You have to have emerging new situations. Until and unless there's the chokka, you can't get out of your house, as it were. Changes in moves, information levels that keep on varying, termination of roles, and a payoff. Somebody has to win. There has to be a stake, as it were. If in a game of football, somebody has to win, and that is what the great joy of the game is in. And it suggests that, the gaming is also shattering illusions about answers and best choices, and it is inherently incomplete, and there's this energy of the gaming process. So the game is forever, once you play a game, you can play it once again, so it goes on, as it were. Now, Calloy, of course, talks about free separateness, uncertainty, unproductive make-believe. So gaming is, as you remember, workaday is different from holiday. Gaming is associated with holiday, as it were. And there is this suggestion that play, reality, and culture are synonymous and interchangeable. Now, when you are reading a book or a novel or a detective novel, which is the most formulaic of fictions, you are engaging in this procedure of play. Now, let me tell you how this happens. And this is a joke which I share with most of my students. All of my students have heard this from me, but I unfailingly say this to all in a class. This has to do with a film that me and my wife went to watch. It was called Shah Rukh Khan and Preeti Zinta had starred in it. It was called, what was it called, if anybody remembers? There's this Navy...
Veer Zara.
Veer Zara, right. So you see, my students have heard about this, where the protagonist sort of meets his beloved after 20 years and they're running at each other. This is the standard romance, isn't it? See, after a long time, and they embrace and they kiss and so on and so forth. And me and my wife were there in the cinema hall, where a couple of elderly ladies, very obviously good fans of Shah Rukh Khan, were weeping copiously into their handkerchiefs. And me, being the Sternian who was looking at this as entirely a play, a game which was being played, was laughing out loud at the way in which they were crying. And they were extremely angry at me, and then asked me this question: if you really don't want to weep, and if you don't really want to, react to this film, why have you come here? Now think about this, everybody here. When you go to watch a film, when you read a book, you know what is going to happen in most of the cases. You know that the detective will catch the criminal. It is very infrequently that, the detective turns out to be the criminal, as in The Mousetrap, or for that matter, the narrator turns out to be the criminal, as in The Murder of Roger Ackroyd. But generally, you play the game with the author, and there are certain moves that the author makes. So what is happening is that Sterne is laying bare, and that's a phrase which I'm borrowing once again from Shklovsky, who's one of my favorite critics once again, laying bare the rules through which this game of reading operates. So in a certain way, that is why Shklovsky will call it the most typical novel of literature, because it is laying bare the ways in which this novel is framed, in which we operate in realist fiction. We believe that the novel is true. We are taken in by the characters who are obviously false. Stern is laying bare this element. Therefore, Stern sees reading as a game between the author and the reader, and uses the motif of play to highlight his metafictional technique. But you see, the sense of play is not just in terms of the reader and the author, but the author is playing with the form and genre. The novel is playing upon your imagination. The author is playing with language and suggestion. And the novel plays with the theory of writing itself. In fact, there's a very strong image of masturbation in the novel, where, Stern says, Tristram says rather, matter grows in our hands. So the way in which, it's almost a masturbatory novel in the way in which the author is playing around with his own novel, with the own process of writing. And you see, this sexual metaphor is something that, permeates this novel time and time and time again. So the notion of play here is a very deeply ingrained notion within the novel itself. So you have to be alert while you are reading Stern. You can't be just, a passive recipient. Now, let me come back to a more simplistic way of looking at it, and the challenge to plot, obviously. Now, Stern obviously starts this with the notion of where does one start? That's the question he asks you. And he says you have the start at the start, ab ovo, and if not in the middle of things, medias res. So where does one start a life? Stern says not at birth, but the moment when, you are being conceived, the moment your parents are copulating, as it were. And, in the middle of things, suddenly Mrs. Shandy talks about the winding of the clock. Obviously, you can see the associations. The theory of association is something I'll come to in a moment. But Stern is fundamentally asking you, playfully, where does one start? Where does your life start? Where does one start the novel? Now, Stern then proceeds to rupture our expectations of conventional openings and questions the very important aspect of causation of the novel. You see, the novel moves from one event to the other through a pattern of a cause. Causality is the link between events. What Stern does is he randomizes events. So one event does not lead to another. It may lead to, but after 3 books. And immediately you digress into another event. So Tristram is born well into the 3rd book of the novels, thereby, Life and Opinions of Tristram Shandy is defeating the very purpose of that title. And by the time the novel has ended, he's merely 3 years old, but he has, of course, grown old in the meantime, but at the end he's 3 years old. So novelistic time is something which Stern completely randomizes and does not follow a Bildungsroman as, say, Fielding would have followed in Tom Jones. And the novel ends with the failure of Toby's answers, the importance, and that importance is a very significant term here, of the Shandy bull and Yorick's voice announcing that the story is about a cock and a bull, and one of the best of its kind I ever heard. So beginning ruptured, ending ruptured, causation ruptured, plot ruptured. Stern is questioning the very basis of realistic conventions of narrative. And of course, then there are the digressions. You have the Lefevre episode, you have Slockenbergius, the episode, you have the Yorick episode. So even start and then they digress. And Stern has this sensational announcement of beginning one sentence and trusting to Almighty God for the second. In fact, there is no plot. And you see, one of my young friends, Rishiraj, who's working on Joyce, periodically reminds me of, the way in which Sterne is really a forefather of Joyce. But you see, Rishiraj, the point remains that Sterne has no structure at all, whereas Joyce still follows a certain mythical structure, although there is a sort of randomization of that. But in Sterne, there is an absolute lack of structure, much in the way I would say Joyce operates in one of his texts only, and that is Finnegan's Wake. But we can come back to this later on. And then Goldsmith made this very important talk that Sterne has 40 sly things said on the occasion, and if there is a god in Tristram Shandy, then his name is Muddle. And very importantly, you see, the digressions mean that there is no coherent sense of plot. Sterne is deconstructing this notion. What did Sterne have to say about this? Sterne termed his novel a mystic labyrinth, and he talked about digressions incontestably as the sunshine, the soul of reading. Take them out of this book, for instance, and you might as well take the book along with them. Now, you have to understand something very carefully, that Sterne is doing this with a purpose. And this purpose has to do with the Enlightenment philosophy of Locke. So keep this at the back of your mind. Why Sterne is doing this is a question I'm going to answer when I come to the philosophy of Locke. So the challenge to the plot is a very deliberate philosophical challenge that Sterne is throwing at you. And then, of course, there is this line which sort of immediately links Sterne with the modernists. And he says, I defy the best cabbage planter to go on coolly, critically, and canonically planting his cabbages one by one in straight lines and stoical distances. Now, the quotation which you would remind yourselves of is life as a luminous hello, not a series of gig lamps symmetrically arranged. But you see, there is a point here that Sterne, while he is modernist in many ways, is more postmodernist than modernist, because he's sort of randomizing these things, whereas in modernism, there is still a sense of structure. I'll come back to this subsequently a little later, maybe. So Sterne has taken the plot upside down. The other thing that he takes upside down is the second pillar of the realist novel, and that is character. And, as it is, Tristram Shandy has very few characters. But even then, Uncle Toby or Walter Shandy are not fully realized characters, but what Sterne calls them as hobby horses. Now, what was the hobby horse? The hobby horse was a traditional figure accompanying the Morris dance, a wicker horse-like frame, strapped to the waist, whisking and frisking in the luxury of nonsense. So the hobby horse was a man who was associated with the horse, and then he was associated with a form of nonsense, and he was associated with one particular, fixation, as it were. The operative word would probably be one humor, as it were. And therefore, look at how Sterne is defining the hobby horse. He says there's doubtless a communication between them of some kind, and there's something in the manner of electrified bodies. The heated parts of the reader, once again, there's a small sexual innuendo there, which comes immediately into contact with the back of the hobby horse. Long journeys and much friction play once again on the sexuality. It so happens that the body of the rider is at length filled as full of the hobby horsical matter. So in that sense, what Sterne is trying to say is that the hobby horse has enveloped the character. So the character is a position. The character is an outlook. He's no longer a human being. In using this term, of course, Sterne was probably classifying Walter and Toby as attitudes rather than characters. Walter, therefore, is the philosopher's gloriosa, who sees philosophy in everything. Right? So birth is philosophy, death is philosophy. every single event is a source of launching into a philosophical diatribe. And Toby, of course, everything about Toby is about the sentimental. Therefore, Toby is the sentimental naive, and I'll come to sentiment and Hume in a matter of a few minutes. Yet in their gestures, in their accurate physical descriptions, they are individuals who are present in the narrative. And if you're interested, you can take a look at, you see, the Fielding, the notion of caricature that Fielding and Hogarth popularized in the 18th century. You see, in Joseph Andrews, for example, in the figure of Square and Thwackum, for example, Fielding talks about, and Hogarth draws them, are caricatures who are, figures with exaggerated characteristics. But I would rather locate the Sternian sense of character in the Menippean way, in which they become figures who embody certain philosophical positions rather than actual human beings. Yet, the magic of Sterne is that he is, almost in a Micawberian, Dickensian way, creating them as very alive characters. Now, the third, this is where the text becomes problematic and more problematic, is the notion of time. Now, the notion of time that we have is what we call chronological time, clock time, where everything is measured out with great precision into exact intervals. Right? This is what clock time is about. Now, the realist novel will, of course, follow this clock time, although there might be flash forwards, flashbacks, but what basically the Bildungsroman, the life novel, does is follow this clock time. What Sterne does is very interesting. He, in fact, sort of anticipates the other notion of time, and that is emotional time. The Bergsonian concept of dury or duration, where the moment, as it were, is not just one moment, but the concentrated emotion of that moment, they stretch that out for a far lengthier interval. And then Sterne asks us, what time are we to accord in the novel? What is the sense of time that the novelist will use? So his narrative, as it were, and remember, everything in Sterne will have a knottiness, a double entendre, as it were, a sexual implication, narrative moving backwards and forwards. So in a certain way, when you're reading Sterne, you are actually intellectually coupling with Sterne, copulating with Sterne, engaging in sexual play with him, challenging the chronological thrust of the 18th century novels. If you read Defoe, for example, if you read Fielding, for example, even Richardson, for example, chronological time is the time that is being used. Sterne is challenging it. And then there's this obsessive concern with time in the sense that time is inseparable from the self and from the ontological process of writing. You see, there's another third dimension. When one writes a life history, you see, if I am writing my autobiography, by the time I have written, the moment has passed. You see, this is very interesting, isn't it? And Sterne is always therefore looking at how does the self, or how does the writing self, capture the moment of the self. So it's always an impossible way. In the way in which you write your life, writing your life is always impossible, because by the time you have written it, yourself is a different self. Yet Tristram himself is unable to cope with his time. As I say, time seems to move faster than he writes. And this entire project that Walter Shandy writes, you see, he's wanting to write this Tristopedia. And forever he's thwarted because Tristram has already grown a little bit by the time he's writing about him. And therefore his failure to regulate his writing to keep up with the passage of time highlights the problem of any narrator to negotiate time and narrative. I do not know if any of you are working with autobiographical narratives, or what they're now called life writings. But you see, once again, what the autobiographical narrator will always do is sift through moments in time and present certain variations of time. So in a way, if you're working with autobiography and life writing, Tristram Shandy is a text to go back and take a look at. And you see, this surreal moment in Tristram Shandy where he's saying, time wastes too fast, whilst thou art looking that twisting that lock, see, it turns grey. Right. So, Sterne, despite what I'm trying to suggest is, despite the laughter that this novel provokes, the sexuality that it provokes, you read it as something which is very non-serious. It's a very deadly serious novel. It's a deadly serious novel because it is asking us very basic questions about how we look at conventions in narrative. You see, as a reader, you have to be alert to what Sterne is doing. Sterne is continually playing you, as it were. And then again, there's this salient moments which demand stretched out intervals of time, right? That is the Bergsonian concept of Dury, which many of you must have talked about in your readings of the modernist text. The modernist is the period which actually takes this concept of Dury and interrogates it. Look at Virginia Woolf, for example. Look at Joyce, for example. Even D.H. Lawrence, for example. So, in his novel, certain moments seem to be stretched because of their interest in the narrative. As Walter and Toby wait for Tristram's birth, the narrator records the exact chronological duration, 2 hours and 10 minutes, yet for them it seems an age. And time stops, as it were. Very often, there's this point where time, as it were, stops in narrative. Walter's foot hovers a step while the story meanders and comes down only after the digression has been completed. Right. So, what are digressions in narrative? Do they figure in the time of the novel or they don't? Sterne is asking you these basic questions. Therefore, my thesis is that Sterne sees time as a continuum where the present is inextricably linked with events and associations from the past. Once again, it comes down to this question of association, isn't it? And Locke. You see, Sterne is a fictional answer, or Tristram Shandy is a fictional answer to Locke. And therefore, it is imperative that sooner or later, we will have to arrive at Locke. And we will have to understand what these playful mechanisms are all about. And therefore, as soon as one event crops up, the entire gamut of correlated events, stories, reflections arrive with them. And therefore, this being very similar to the stream of consciousness narrative. And Sterne is transforming Locke's idea of duration from the intellectual plane to the emotional and the aesthetic. This is something which I mentioned. Bergson is doing this to the intellectual. Sterne is doing this to the aesthetic. And he abandons the imaginary lines of clocks and seasons and talks about the endless flow of a mental dimension. There's also something which is more than Locke in this text, and this is death. You see, death is the end of time, at least for us. For a particular person, death is the end of time. So, for Sterne, the motion of time is synonymous with that of death. Writing Tristram Shandy with the consciousness of illness and imminent death, Sterne's play with time is in many ways, therefore, a defined gesture. The more death encroaches upon Sterne, the more he playfully eludes it. Right. And therefore, what is the source by which time can be defeated? I am going to argue that Sterne will use laughter as the way in which you can triumph over time. You can throw laughter in the face of death. Of course, there's also this notion of intertextuality. Sterne is a book of books, remember? And what are the texts that he's drawing upon here? I've talked about Menippean satire. Of course, the major text that he's drawing upon is Cervantes. Don Quixote is at the back of his mind in the picturization of Toby. There's, of course, in the Philosophus Gloriosus and the exaggeration of body and sexuality, this Rabelais, Gargantua and Pantagruel. Then there's Burton, the anatomy of melancholy and the satire on the Philosophus Gloriosus, and of course, Erasmus, the plays of folly. So satirizing learned blockheads and opening up the possibility of frustrating univocal interpretations. And it's this, once again, this Erasmus, Burton, Gargantua, Cervantes, all of them create a tradition. You see, remember F.R. Lewis, when he talks about the great tradition of the novel, he talks about Austen, Conrad, talks about George Eliot, for example. He leaves out Dickens. Very interesting. And then there's this alternative great tradition to the tradition of realism, which starts with Cervantes, continues with Sterne, then comes Diderot, then comes Joyce, and then come the postmodernists. By the way, this is not my thesis. I have taken this from Robert Alter's concept of the other great tradition in the novel. Think about this, those of you who are reading the novel, how there is always an anti-novel discourse, you know, in the anti-realism discourse within the novel. And all of them are critical of creating systems. You see, the realist novel creates two systems. One is the formal system, and the other is the ideological system, right? The ideology that it seeks to foreground through this organization of the form. Now, what Sterne and Rabelais and Cervantes and Burton are doing are they are questioning whether there are such univocal, unipolar system making possible or not. And that is what Rabelais is also all about. So you see, when I'm talking about Sterne, you know, and this is my magic here, because is that I am going to go all out from all angles and digress, because that is what Sterne is doing. And that is what, you know, when you're reading Sterne, you are doing. And when I'm teaching Sterne would be a paradox, as it were. I have to alert you to the possibilities. Sterne says that there's no one interpretation for me. You know, there's varieties of interpretation that are available. And then comes this great notion of the printed book. You see, when you take up a printed book in your hand, you very often forget that the white pages are filled with black print, and that there are punctuations, there are gaps, there is the page, and there are the illustrations that make up the book. So all this adds together to the meaning that the book seeks to convey. So Sterne then goes about deconstructing punctuation, as it were. Take the use of the dash, for example. The dash can be used to define a given moment with exact precision. It can dramatize the consciousness of a character in all its exactness. It can also comically deflate the gravity by invoking parody. You see, for the realist, the use of the dash is that pause, the pregnant pause, as it were, when meaning is generated. For Sterne, the use of the dash is that pause when meaning is exploded, when laughter is generated. Right? You see, this is the great episode where Widow Wadman is looking at, you know, wants to know where Toby is wounded. Toby, of course, being unaware of sexuality, or rather naive to sexuality, thinks that, you know, where is he wounded on the siege of Namur? And therefore, on the bowling green, he wants to point to the exact spot. And Widow Wadman actually wants to know where in Toby's anatomy, especially his groin, has he been wounded. And you see, there is Widow Wadman. Lord, I cannot look at it. Dash. What would the world say if I look at it? I should drop down if I looked at it. Dash. I wish I could look at it. Dash. See what is happening in that, you know, in that printed page. There can be no sin in looking at it. I will look at it. Right? Take a look at how the asterisk and the pause and that dash functions on that page. So Sterne is, as it were, playing around with that very notion of punctuation itself. And look at the Lefevre episode, for example. Lefevre is the soldier who comes to the village and is nursed by the Shandys and dies. Nature instantly ebbed again, dash. The film returned to its place, dash. The pulse fluttered, dash. Stopped, dash. Went on, dash. Throbbed, dash. Very realistic. Moved again, dash. Moved, dash. Stopped again, dash. Then comes the metafictional, explosion of this, suddenly dissolving this into laughter, this moment of great, emotion, great sentiment, dissolved into laughter. Shall I go on? Dash. No. Right. See what Stern is doing is exploring the way in which narrative creates emotions and is showing you how this is done by punctuation in a very, very overt way. Therefore, is questioning the way in which the book creates meaning. Take a look once again, therefore, at the first edition in the way the dash is used. In fact, Stern uses many dashes, long dashes, short dashes. If he were using a keyboard, as it were a computer keyboard, you would have used all the keys on the keyboard, quite obviously. This is his manuscript, by the way. This is a picture that I actually took from Shandy Hall. By the curator actually allowed me to take this picture of the manuscript, and you can see Stern's handwriting there. So there's also this notion of the asterisk. The dash is a pause. The asterisk is something which gives you a kind of indefiniteness. It's either or many, right? So meaning is, as it were, suspended in the asterisk. You have to know this very carefully. So Stern uses this from Swift and allows him to bring the multiple meanings into simultaneous play. And the Victorians suggested that it was a way of talking body, that Stern was trying to write smut, pornography into fiction. But it is rather a mode through which the reader's imagination is liberated, and he moves from the show to the showman. So while the capitals and Gothic letters supply heavier emphasis, asterisks and other blank spaces provide only, they deny rather, only one active responses. They create hiatuses where many meanings are liberated. Right. I'll come to this in a moment, but there's also this graphic representation on the novel. Stern is actually showing you the digressions on the plot. As you can see, he's drawing graphs on the book. Then comes this black page. Alas, poor Yorick. How does one, narrativize death? Stern says it's not possible. Death is end. Death is closure. You cannot talk about it. Therefore, bang, black page. Then comes, of course, once again, a page which I've missed here showing this is the blank page, when Widow Wadman's beauty is being described. And Stern says, my concept of beauty is different from yours, reader. So you write your own concept of beauty. And you see how very interestingly, Stern is arriving at this notion of the lisible script. The scriptable text from Barth. You see, Barth talks about the
Sir, excuse me, sir. Excuse me, sir.
Obita, you are muted.
Sir, sir, your presentation is not visible. Your presentation is not visible, sir.
Now is it visible?
Yes, Amrita, it's visible.
Right. Okay. So, how far? When was I muted? Did I talk about the black?
Scriptable text.
Yeah, right.
We just started about it.
Right. So you see, very interestingly, Barth is talking about two different kinds of text: the readerly text and the writerly text. Where the writerly text becomes a text where the reader is, as it were, part of a participant in the process of creation. And when Sterne is providing us with this blank page, he is suddenly, in a leap, as it were, allowing this novel to suddenly move into the zone of that scriptable text, where you see you have to draw the picture, the pen picture of Widow Wadman in your own way. And you see, this point is being highlighted also in this concept of the marbled page. Now, you see, you'll have to remember something, that the conventions of printing in the 18th century meant that in the press, each of these marbled pages would be different from one another. So what Sterne is suggesting to us, and playfully suggesting, is that every book is a different book. So you see, we are used to suggestions that, you know, every edition of Robinson Crusoe is the same edition for all of us. Sterne is suggesting that every book is a different book for his reader. So if this is the marble page in one of his texts, this is the marble page in another of his texts. The same text, but different marbled pages. Now that is an interesting thought, isn't it? The book that you take up in your hand, have you ever interrogated the form of the book itself? Sterne is forcing, and this is really magical because this hasn't been done in print earlier. He's forcing you to look at and, you know, solidify the book, as it were. Look at the concept of the book for the first time. So in a sense, in terms of book history also, Sterne has this deconstructive paradigm, as it were. Now, of course, I've talked about Walter Shandy as Menippean satire. I need to talk about this a little bit more because, you see, Sterne is talking about the philosophus gloriosus, whose system making has to be exploded. And therefore, you know, his hobby horse, he has to be unmounted from his hobby horse. And Walter Shandy and Toby both are seen as solipsistic and impotent. You see, take this moment, for example, when Tristram is to be named. So what is the name that, you know, Walter Shandy plans for Tristram? Is Trismegistus, who is one of these great, you know, hermetic philosophers, one of the most obscure, you know, philosophies of medieval age. Now, by the time Obadiah, the maid, has run up to the chamber to tell this to the priest, she has forgotten Trismegistus. So the name that comes up to her is Tristram, and Triste means sad. So there is this gap, you see, between the philosopher's system making and the actual reality. And that is once again a point where Sterne will be going back to Locke. You see, Locke is the key, right? Locke is the key to understanding Tristram Shandy. Now, these are two paintings, rather illustrations by Hogarth, you know, used as frontispieces really. And you see, when I talked about caricature, the philosophus gloriosus, you can see, you know, the Parson Yorick reading out, and you can see here on the chair, you know, Walter Shandy before that fireplace. You see, the entire picturization of Walter Shandy is drawn in terms of a cartoon, in terms of this caricature, as it were. So it's important to understand that Sterne's maximum satire is directed against the figure of Walter, and by Walter, through Walter rather, towards Locke. Of course, there's another satire that is being drawn here, and that is at Toby. You see, Toby apparently is this benevolent soul who can't even hurt a fly. Take a look at that, you know, fly episode where Toby sort of swats a fly and then lets it go and says, go, says he, lifting up the sash, go, poor devil, get thee gone, why should I hurt thee? this world surely is wide enough to hold both thee and me, right? So apparently Toby is the one who can, cross across all barriers through his sentiment. And that is what, you see, very importantly, David Hume was suggesting. Hume was this figure who was providing an alternative to the discourse of reason. And he was suggesting that the true reason could only be shown through sentiment, where, we create a sense of community through sentiment, whereas reason can, as it were, segregate us. You don't think in the way I do, but we all feel in the same way. So Hume talks about the principle of sympathy by which we enter into the sentiments of the rich and the poor, the force of sympathy in all human creation. Now, since most of you are English honor students and teachers of English literature, I will remind you of the great sentimental novelists. For example, I have taught Mackenzie's The Man of Feeling in one of my courses. I've talked about Addison and Steele more importantly, being this great sentimental novelist. Now, towards the middle of the century, of course, you have the anti-sentimental backlash. You can see that in plays that most of us have read in our undergraduate syllabus. For example, Sheridan or Goldsmith. So this is the satire against the tradition of sentiment that was being created through philosophers like Hume and later on Adam Smith. So Sterne is experimenting with this mode of sentimentality. Remember, he wrote A Sentimental Journey, that was his final text. But even there, and in Tristram Shandy, does Sterne see sentiment as a valid interpretation of life? The answer is no, because Toby too is important. And Toby is rendered important by the war. And secondly, Toby is so wrapped up in his discourse of war, mock war again, not real war, mock war and sentiment, that he fails to understand any other discourse, either that of Walter or that of the widow Wadman. So Toby is as isolated as Walter, confined in his hobbyhorsical space of the bowling green, and his failure to communicate with a normal social point of view is underscored with his interactions with widow Wadman. And it is Toby, after all, remember, for whom the window sashes are removed and the window sash falls on Tristram's nose. And of course, Sterne will say, by the nose, I mean a nose and nothing else than a nose. Very obviously, the association is with the penis. Therefore, Toby is not only important himself, he also renders Tristram important. So see, why is importance such a very strong significance in the text? Because Sterne sees philosophical systems as important in understanding life. And that is where, you see, the satire against sentiment and Toby operates. This is something which we have already talked about. It can never be a model for behavior, aberrant and eccentric, a momentary privilege that is both absurd and admirable. So the love fever episode, which is the most sentimental episode, quickly degenerates into laughter. Sterne is deconstructing and, as it were, continually, sort of dissolving these moments of philosophy through laughter. Of course, there's this new author-reader relationship that we have to talk about. And it talks about the protagonist of Tristram Shandy, one might argue, is the reader. And that is where I come back to this question of the scriptable text. The reader is always creating meaning within Tristram Shandy, within himself. And Sterne is forever showing this to you. And Sterne himself had suggested that, Tristram is setting upon the reader, drawing him about, harassing him, upbraiding him, riding him, stimulating and provoking him. There's an equal engagement and play. You cannot read Sterne in the way you're reading Agatha Christie, for example. You have to engage with him. And that is where Sterne is again the forefather of another great modernist, Joyce. You cannot read Joyce lightly. You have to engage with him, right? So the truest respect, Sterne said, is to halve the matter amicably and leave the matter to the imagination of the reader. Now, those of you who are interested in reader response criticism will remember Wolfgang von Iser and the concept of this medial zone where reader and author together create meaning. Sterne is always asking you to be his co-partner in the process of creation. And then he says, as we jog on, either laugh with me or at me, or in short, do anything, but keep your temper and be with me. So, and this is something which bothered the Victorians a lot. Thackeray, for example, talked about Sterne always watching my face, watching his effect, coaxing, imploring me. He was very uncomfortable with this idea of Sterne always asking him what he's thinking, right? And gaps, leaps, fragments are a comic fulfillment of the comment that nothing be lost. And therefore, when he's asking, when it's just said, it fell on my nose, and he says, hey, reader, where is your mind leading thee? So he's asking you continuously, he's showing you how there are two readers inside you. One is the puritanical reader, and the other is the naughty, body reader, as it were, whose associations are leading him astray. And all this, of course, has been created by me and Sterne, rather Sterne and me, to come to this point and his critique of Locke. You see, why is Locke important? We talk about cognition, we talk about the Cartesian theory of reason, the Cartesian cogito, for example, Descartes being the philosopher of the Enlightenment. If there was one philosopher of the English Enlightenment, it was Locke. And Locke's Essay of Human Understanding was considered to be the fundamental book of empirical reality and empirical philosophy, which truly created a paradigm shift in philosophy. The moment of passage when we moved towards our modernity, when it was thought that you could create systems of knowledge based purely on experience. But I don't have the time to go on about Locke, but please remember that Locke was the book that really unlocked the human mind. But what did Locke suggest? Locke suggested that, you see, reason could create paradigms and models. Therefore, when Locke says government, he talks about a rational system of government. When Locke talks philosophy, he talks about reason as creating simple, complex ideas and the arrival at truth. Now, Sterne takes Locke. But what does he take from Locke? He takes the theory of association. What is the theory of association? This is the operative quote. All of you who are reading Tristram Shandy for your syllabus must know this. Ideas that are themselves, this is book 2 of the Essay of Human Understanding, ideas that are themselves not at all of kin come to be so united, Locke says, in a man's mind, that it is very hard to separate them. So one idea comes, its associative idea also comes to you. And the no sooner at any time comes into the understanding, but its associate appears with it. And if they are more than two, which are thus united, the whole gang, always inseparable, shew themselves together. This is the doctrine of Tristram Shandy, taken from Locke. So if you're thinking of nose, immediately the penis comes into your mind. If you're thinking of moving and backwards and forwards, obviously the idea of sex comes into your mind. But what did Locke say about this? Where did Locke say about this? Because, Locke's ideas were not so random. If you create a system, you cannot create it on random ideas. You have to segregate them and create a paradigm. What did Locke say about the theory of ideas? He suggested that the rational man could segregate ideas only the irrational and mad man, the species of madness, submitted and surrendered to the idea of the theory of association of ideas. You see what Stern has done? Stern has taken a Lockean concept and used it inside out. What for Locke was a recipe for madness becomes for Stern the doctrine of Tristram Shandy. Right, it's a pervasive sense of parody. Stern draws upon a passage from Locke about the cause of obscurity in simple ideas. So, association of ideas does not lead to clarity of ideas, it leads to jumble and muddles. What does Stern have to say? Stern says that this is what the principle on which, of the great Locke on which my Tristram Shandy is based. So, Stern is therefore, through Walter Shandy once again, talking about the philosophus gloriosus, whose system of philosophy is always fallacious, that there are always alternatives to it, and Stern is foregrounding this alternative. Right. So the seriousness of Locke's argument is therefore subverted by suggestive innuendo. Once again, let me come back for a moment to the Lockean idea of language. Locke suggests that language is transparent. That language, how does one convey the idea? Through language. That language can convey the exactness and the precision of the idea. What does Stern say? That language is always slippery. The beautiful oblique can also be that oblique punctuation mark. That language can always create zones of meaning which are never intended. Right? So, the critique of the Lockean idea of order and the notion of language is at the core of Stern. Stern is playing Locke. Stern is playing with Locke, turning him inside out. The Lockean idea of rationality is at the basis of the realistic novel. The Sternian play with the Lockean idea is at the basis of the anti-novel and the post-modern novel. So thus in Locke, there is the final argument about the reliable connection between the individual mind and the external world. Stern accepts Locke's mechanism, but denies its consequences. In the world of Tristram Shandy, and that is where I come to my more or less final point, system making is denied. Rigidity, no, not a final point, there's one more point there. System making is denied. Rigidity of interpretation is thwarted. So, no Locke, no rationality, no sentiment, no plot, no character, no punctuation, language is slippery. Therefore, what is there? What is the one thing which can defeat time? What man can throw against time? And for Stern, it is a celebration of sexuality. So he he offers an alternative by harnessing two forces within the novel, that of sexuality and imagination. Now, the Victorians, of course, called it as nasty trifling. In fact, there is a joke which I want to share for a moment from this heavy metal that Stern is throwing at you. Let me quickly dissolve it into laughter, because laughter is something that Stern will talk about also. You see, Stern, whenever he went to London, was derided by many Puritans. So he walked into a room and everybody introduced him, this is the great author of Tristram Shandy. And there was this one puritanical gentleman who refused to rise from his seat. And he said, I never make way for fools. Stern immediately stood aside and said, but I always do. Right. So you see, this is a man who suggested that the way out of this randomness could be the celebration of sexuality. So it is saturated with sexual suggestiveness. The hobbyhorse is the representation of the whore. Toby is a slang for the posterior. The references to noses, fingers, sausages, wind instruments, fingers, stiff, wicked joints. Obadiah is mounted upon a strong monster of a coach horse. And I already have pointed out how Sterne is perennially talking about the masturbatory effect of writing, as it were, matter grows under our own hands. Yet, in the novel, sexuality becomes the bond, the only channel of communication that can lead to human bonding, right? The characters who are denied sexuality are denied human bonding. For example, Walter and Toby, and later on even Tristram. It is the more minor characters, for example, Mrs. Shandy, for example, Trim, for example, Obadiah, for example, who engage with sexuality, even Widow Wadman, who are seen as the more, alive characters who can cope with society in Tristram Shandy, right? Even the Shandy bull is found to be important, right? So Walter feels that our appetites but are our diseases, so non-sexual, and his monthly intercourse is in the beds of justice. So he just has to, copulate so that he fulfills the contract bond of marriage. Toby too is important because of his war wound and also because of his sentimentality. So two philosophical systems, that of Locke and Hume, are shown to be leading to importance in social behavior, right? Consequently, there's an absolute failure of communication in the entire novel. The only fulfilling relationship is between Trim and Bridget, the corporal Trim, the servant, and that is achieved through their healthy sexual intercourse. Now, while foregrounding this, I'm sorry this is getting a little lengthy, but bear with me, Tristram Shandy is not a simple novel. Sterne is also forcing the reader to acknowledge our pervasive sexual awareness. So ultimately, sexuality is not about corporal Trim and the characters of the novel. Sexuality is about you and me, the way in which it is pervasively integrated into our consciousness. And how does he do it? He uses innuendo to show how we are at two levels, the suave, the polite level, whilst the sexual level is always there, rippling underneath the surface. So he forces us to acknowledge our awareness of sexuality. So when he says by a nose, I mean a nose, and nose, the external human organ of smelling, is always tickling our sense of sexuality. And then comes his interrogation of the reader, is forever asking you, hey man, what are you thinking? Fairly and softly, gentle reader. So it's not only the man here, but also the woman. Where is thy fancy leading thee? If there is any truth in man, by my great-grandfather's nose, I mean the external organ of smelling. I declare by that word, I mean a nose, and nothing more or less. So ultimately, the joke is on you. Sterne is showing you how sexuality is also something which you are continuously dealing with. And therefore, it forces us to bear the responsibility of the perversion of language, makes us acknowledge that sexuality is everybody's Sancho Panza. So in foregrounding this, Sterne's attitude towards sexuality is frank and stimulating. He brings a taboo subject out of the private closet, scrutinizing it and examining it as a healthy communicative model. Right. There's also this association between sexuality, imagination, and creativity. So this entire telling of the story, as it were, is an act of sexuality. Reading it is an act of pleasure. And once again, the operative critic you may talk about is the pleasure principle within Barthes. The pleasure of the text. What is textual pleasure all about? What is the pleasure of reading all about? And therefore, Stubbson talks about Swift and Sterne. Swift is perennially warning us against the body. Sterne is calling for the cooperation of the body and the mind, right? The final point and this is the final point, I swear, is the celebration of laughter. You see, if sexuality is one of the ways in which communication can be made, the other mode of communication in Tristram Shandy is laughter. And therefore, Tristram talks about the careless kind of civil, nonsensical, good-humored Shandian book And he talks about this concept of true Shandism, opening the heart and lungs, and like all those affectations which partake of its nature, forces the blood and the vital fluids to run freely into its channels. You see, Sterne is seeing, rather than sentiment, laughter as something which binds us together. Now, laughter is a very problematic category. I can't discuss it here, but Sterne is seeing laughter as something which can be thrown against time, thrown against death, and which can create a community of readers who are sharing this laughter and this sexuality together. Therefore, my point being that Sterne is probing deeply into the philosophical roots of communication, into the ways in which the self negotiates experience and death. Sterne refuses to accept any abstract system. Any system making is an anathema to him. He harmonizes the body, the mind, the imagination, and the comic, plays one against the other, implying that any determinate, unified theory is fallible. Sterne, therefore, emerges as another major critic against Enlightenment system making, be it either through reason or through the sentiment. What did the novel mean? In his letter to Dr. John Eustace, this is something which I want all students here also to note. He said that your walking stick is no sense more Shandy, and these were walking stick. You have seen walking sticks with one handle. In those days, walking sticks were fancy things which had many handles. So in having more handles than one, the parallel breaks only in this, that in using the stick, everyone will take the handle which seeks his convenience. In Tristram Shandy, the handle is taken which suits their passions, their ignorance, or sensitivity. So if you want to enter through reason, you take the Lockean handle. If you want to enter through sentiment, you take the Tobian handle. You can walk through it with the sexual handle, with the laughter handle, whichever handle you want, whichever interpretation you want is the handle that you will use. And you see how Sterne is opening the door for Roland Barthes, the author and the reader, or maybe for that matter, the reader response theory, where the reader and the author together are creating meaning, or where the reader himself is creating multiple meanings. Now that is where Sterne's reputation lies. Associations with the modernist notion of the stream of consciousness, although I contest this very severely. I suggest that Sterne is more of a postmodernist who revels in anarchy and randomness rather than any coherent system making as such, because after all, the stream of consciousness is an alternative mode of responding to realism. It's associated with postmodern play and fragmentation. I suggest that this is the founding text of English overt metafiction. I don't have time to define this here, but this is the first real English novel that takes apart and examines every aspect of novel making, the craft of fiction. And of course, I would relate with Joyce and his recognition of the ingenuity of Sterne. Joyce was the first real, author who understood what Sterne was doing. Although I would say that in France, Diderot had done it earlier. Now, let me end this discussion with a story again, because Sterne did love to spin a yarn. Now, Sterne died in London, where his grave was, where he was buried, and his grave was in London. Now, crazily, his body was dug up from his grave and used in an anatomy class by grave looters. So when the students, opened up Sterne, somebody recognized, hey, this is Lawrence Sterne, the author. So they immediately sewered him up, and then his body was buried in London. After a time, it was interred, his remains were taken and burnt at Coxwold. right? His own village. So you actually have two gravestones to Stern. One, which was established by the Freemasons, interestingly, who thought that Stern was of their brotherhood, who had mastered the magic craft of fiction. And the other was at Coxwold, where, you know, it's a more, where the Christian church actually buried Stern as his own. So this is a man, interestingly, who has two gravestones to his credit, two graves to his credit, and even in his grave, there is the sense of play. I think Stern would have had a great laugh about it after he passed away from wherever he is. And this is the Coxwold graveyard, where the grave of Stern actually watches over the grave of Cromwell and probably laughs at him, because Cromwell was this great Puritan and Stern was this great anti-Puritan. Stern, therefore, was this tissue of paradoxes, a pastor who experimented with free sexuality, the novelist who took apart the novel, the Lockean who deconstructed Locke, the one who deconstructed Hume, deconstructed the book, deconstructed the way in which punctuation was handled, in the way in which time was handled. My point, dear students who are reading Stern, is that you are reading the book of a lifetime. You know, in no other book, I know most of you are disheartened by Tristram Shandy, you cannot make head and tail out of it. But because you cannot make head and tail out of it, you have to read Tristram Shandy over and over again, understand what he's trying to do with the novel. You know, when I did my thesis on, you know, Fielding and Stern, Stern was the book which I took to my bed every single day, every single night rather. And therefore, the greatest moment of my life was when I actually went to Shandy Hall. You know, this is the only picture I have of myself at Shandy Hall, you know, with the bust of Lawrence Stern. The pictures that you saw were largely taken by me. But look at my relationship with Stern. Stern would have, you know, is looking away from me, laughing probably, and saying, you know, God forbid somebody had to do a thesis on me. So let me come back to the title once again and end my lecture. This is Stern on the Beautiful Oblique. It's a poem which he wrote. And this says, for to this day, when with much pain I try to think straight and clear, I try to do a Lockean system, I siddle out, I fail, and strike into the beautiful oblique. What is the oblique? The oblique is one which is not straight, right? One which, you know, digresses. The beautiful oblique is therefore what is at the core of the Sternian creative principle. That is not formed like the designing of the perisaltic motion that has no coherence, twisting and twining, going to work. And then he ends with that little sexual innuendo there, like a bottle screw upon a cork. That's that poster once again, the beautiful oblique, the failure of communication. Now let's not say failure of communication, the sort of gulf between language and meaning, that great smile that Stern would have had on seeing this poster and called it really Shandian. I hope I have been able to communicate the essence of the novel to you. Should you have any more questions, apart from the session that we will have later on, you can write to me at my email address. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir, for such an engaging, illuminating, and obviously awestruck talk. Sir, first of all, we beg your pardon to interrupt you in the middle of the session, middle of your lecture. And now I request our scholars and students, if they have any doubt, they may ask question either directly by turning their microphone on, or you may inbox us. So there is a. Am I audible, sir?
Yes, of course. Of course, you are audible. Am I audible?
Yes, sir.
Right.
Sir, one of our student, Ahana Das Mahapatra, she had a question. She asked, Tristram Shandy has three major elements which are plot, character, and digressions. How do all the three work together?
Well, they don't work together at all. You see, the only principle that works together is that Stern is, as I have pointed out, is deconstructing all these concepts taken together. You have to see Tristram Shandy in its context. You have the sense of a new form of writing, the new province of writing that Fielding is talking about in Tom Jones. And this new province is based on empirical realities being translated into fictional narrative. You have this in Defoe, you have this then in Richardson, you have this in Fielding. Now, what is the point of commonality in all of them? The point of commonality is what Ian Watt calls formal realism. What is formal realism? Formal realism is distinct name, place, character, and plots which are identifiable, locations and spaces and times which are mappable, right? And what are the principles? If you're very interested, look at Tom Jones. In Tom Jones, Fielding says that you have to have probability, possibility, you cannot include the incredible. Therefore, characters must be identifiable, plausible, and believable. You have to have a plot which will move from one point to the other, which will not be random, which will have a principle of possibility, plausibility, and causation. And ultimately, the novel will convey a distinct kind of an ideology. What Stern does is he uses all these concepts and he randomizes them. He deconstructs plot, deconstructs character, and of course suggests that no causality, no plausibility is possible. What does he do? He lays bare the way in which fiction creates an alternative false world, and that in deconstructing this false world, Stern is pointing out how system making can be critiqued philosophically. So when you talk about plot, character, Stern is actually laying bare the way in which this is done in fiction, right? I told you the story. Next time when you go and watch a film, try and think of my face, and Stern, and then you will, when the hero is about to embrace the heroine, don't laugh like I did, because then you would be shooed away by people in the cinema hall. But you see, at every moment when you watch a film now, think of it as a fiction. Think about the codes that are being used. Think about that character as false. Think about that plot as made up. That is what Stern is setting out to do. He is sort of exploding these notions. Okay, next question, please.
Am I audible?
Yes, go ahead, Shukanto, right.
Okay. Yes. When Victor Slavsky said that this is the most typical novel, so what does he actually mean? Even after listening all these things, I think that this is a kind of a novel of the millennium.
Right. You see, Slavsky is talking about, and this is where I'll just linger on Slavsky for a moment. Slavsky talks about the history of literature, you see, and he says that literature is always marked by a process of automation. You repeat a certain formula over and over and over again. And there comes a moment when there is a process of what he calls defamiliarization. right? When this is made strange, when it is laid bare, and you suddenly enter into another literary epoch, as it were. Now, the best example to study this is probably modernism. You know, what did the modernists actually do? Prior to the modernists, you have the great age of realism, where the conventions of naturalism and realism are, continuously repeated. So an automation takes place. And then suddenly you have, say, for example, Monet, say, for example, Joyce, say, for example, Virginia Woolf, suddenly laying bare the process and creating an alternative. Now, what is the most typical work of literature? The typical work of literature, according to Shklovsky, is this work of literature which lays bare, right? This work of literature which creates this moment of ostraniny or defamiliarization. And it is in this sense, that Shklovsky is referring to Tristram Shandy as that most typical work of literature. Now, what would be another example for me? It would be, for example, any text by Brecht, or say, if you take it in terms of philosophy, a text, Waiting for Godot by Beckett, for example, would be that great moment of, the most typical work of literature. So work that defamiliarizes, right?
Thank you, Amrita.
Sir, there is a long remark and question made by Mr. Subham Datta.
Right.
Stupendous presentation, Amrita. Every time I listen to you, I get some new and interesting insights about looking at things. My question is, can Stern's subversion of the prevailing ideological and philosophical assumptions about realistic fiction and the sense of narrative autonomy be linked with his critique of British imperial policies?
Yes, he's referred to Ignatius Sancho's letter to Lawrence Stern about the anti-slavery movement, and Stern's response was extremely, cogent and clear in the way in which he was distinctly against the slave policies, as it were. But also there is this reference to Stern's journal to Eliza, and Eliza was his beloved, who sailed with her husband to Bombay and India, and therefore the journal is, as it were, shows a few of the glimpses of the of his anti-imperial stances. Now, for Stern, once again, imperialism and colonialism would have been this great system making, which I think he would have largely written against. But you see, Shubham, while I agree with you that by temperament, Stern would have probably laughed at it, I haven't come across very many references of this particular sort. So, in the absence of any coherent and cogent body of literature or letters, I would not venture out to talk about this. In fact, Stern is strangely silent about it. Probably he was too busy writing Tristram Shandy and fighting death at this point of time. Maybe in Tristram Shandy, of course, we do not have it at all. If there's any imperialism which is fighting against, it's the imperial mode of the realist novel writing. So that is as much as I will venture out. The only letter that is the one which you have talked about, but that does not really talk about imperialism.
Sir, Mr. Risiraj Paul, he too made a long remark and then framed a question. I'm quoting his words. Amazing presentation, Amrita. As
No,
student,
I can read the question here. He's talking about the materiality of the text. Thank you, Rishiraj, for your comments, really. But I have talked about the materiality of the text when I refer to the page, the the blank page, for example, the black page, for example, the marble page. The marble page is probably, in my opinion, the most important of them. You see, when I went to Shandy Hall, actually, Shandy Hall has this amazing collection of Stern's library and first edition. So the curator who was there, this an amazing man, really, who took out, he was first of all extremely surprised that somebody from India had actually come to look at Stern in such great detail. And I had by then published my book, so I could give him a copy, and he kept it in the library. But that's aside, he showed me these editions of Stern. You see, the first editions, where he was looking at these and talking about how Stern would travel to London personally to supervise the publication of his texts. It's interesting. In no other author, I think, in the 18th century took such great pains with the material publication of the text. And he used to always tell the printer that every single marble page had to be different in terms of the concentration of ink, the patterns that were given. So, and the curator asked me why Stern was doing this. He wanted actually to by showing that every book was different, by showing how the book was a book, and how page, how punctuation, how print, how white spaces were different, to show how the book was, or how the text was a material being which was being held up as a source of consumption. Once again, Rishiraj, this needs to be also taken up. You see, the novel, the one distinguishing feature of the novel was its status as a consumer item. Now, therefore, when Stern is talking about the materiality of the text, when he's talking about the physical solid book, is he also talking about reading as a process of consumption, reading as a process where you engage in pleasure, and how this pleasure is determined or derived? So in that sense, that question about the materiality of the text is one which, yes, bothers us. And thank you for pointing that out. I did that to a large extent by showing you the actual pages. Those pictures were actually taken from the first edition, which I was fortunate to hold. And it was, as you can see, as you can understand, when you would have held your first copy of the manuscript, a sublime moment for me. Anyway, Stern would have laughed at it. He would have laughed at such reverence altogether.
Thank you, Abhijit.
Thank you.
Sir, there is another question from one of our student, Arga Kamal Goharai. Sir, at first, thank you so much for your beautiful and informative presentation. I have a question. Once Samuel Johnson stated, "Nothing odd will do long. Tristram Shandy did not last." Why he quoted such words? Did he trying to say that Tristram Shandy did not follow the contemporary style of writing novels? Sir, could you please explain this?
Yeah, thank you. That was a nice question, actually. Well read there. Once again, you see, you have to understand that Dr. Johnson was this great figure of Enlightenment system making. In fact, I have been to Dr. Johnson's house as well the last time when I went to London. And you see, if Stern's parlor is one of randomness, Dr. Johnson's is marked by almost obsessive compulsive disorder of ordering. Dr. Johnson was the one who compiled the first English language, if you remember. And he was the one who believed in this, the great philosopher of the neoclassical 18th century. So, works had to be written in imitation of the ancients. They had to follow certain rules and dictum, and they had to conform to system-making ideologies of the period. Now, Stern would be the antithesis of all this. In fact, all the major writers, I point out, were extremely hostile to Stern, because Stern was writing texts which were antithetical to what they believed in. Plus, here was also this pastor who instead of preaching moral sermons was engaging in writing a book which was extremely bawdy. But please remember this, that Tristram Shandy, when it was published, became an international bestseller. You know, it was translated into French, and you can see that Diderot immediately wrote Jacques the Fatalist after he read Tristram Shandy. So it influenced the continent in a very big way also. So you can understand the problems of Dr. Samuel Johnson, who would have believed in every kind of literary exactness and reacted against Sterne. So he was predicting that Sterne would not last. You see, for the postmodernists, of course, Sterne is the one who has lasted, and Dr. Johnson, of course, has receded, I would say, not receded into literary obscurity. But then, once again, when you, as a postmodernist, read something like, say, Umberto Eco, or say Vladimir Nabokov, or say, for that matter, even Borges, or Rushdie, even Rushdie, you are actually going back to Sterne. Because Sterne is the first who said that, randomize, question, contest. So when anybody is experimenting with the form of the novel in any way, the ghost of Sterne is laughing at him from the grave. Right. Any other questions? Or am I muted?
Yes, sir. There is another question from Sobhan Majumdar. In the art of fiction, Milan Kundera starts with Don Quixote when he draws a map of alternative tradition of fictions, largely dominated by philosophical novels. After Cervantes, he talks about Sterne and his great epoch, and then comes to Robert Musil, excluding some of the great realistic novels of the 19th century Europe, including Dickens. My question is, why actually philosophical novels, the gurus of them, generally ignore realistic novels?
You see, once again, please remember that Cervantes, or for that matter, I have already talked about Erasmus, I have talked about Rabelais. You see, the point being that all these novels are not merely philosophical novels. They are novels which are, to a certain extent, also using the burlesque. You see, what for this, you have to understand what philosophy actually means. You remember, philosophy is the search for the truth. Philosophia, right? Sophia being truth, right? So, in a certain sense, all philosophical novelists are aware that they are offering a version of the truth only, a version of the truth, and that alternative versions are also possible. Now, what the realist does is that it projects the realist novel projects a grounded and extremely, what you can call, mundane view of life, whereas the philosophical novel and the burlesque would interrogate the ways in which we perceive truth and critique them. And it is therefore that the philosophical novel will always ignore the realist novel and try and take a look at texts which have attempted in their own ways to point out to systems of truth and to texts which have questioned any unipolar or univocal or unilinear version of truth. I think that is the reason that philosophical novelists will ignore the realist novel and look at these variants only. Now, once again, you see, I have slight problems with these notions of realism. Again, I see James Joyce, for example, as being a great realist. What is realism is a question that we need to also ask. When Rushdie talks about magical realism, is that the realism that we are really talking about? So, when you ask that question, you have to be very careful as to what you, of course, are talking about conventional realism, but you have to ask what is realism and what have its variants been across the ages. But that's what Stern would have wanted you to do. Think more deeply about form and ideology. If you can do that, then you are a good reader.
Sir, can you entertain few more questions?
Few more. Okay, two more probably. I'm out of breath and out of water. Anyways.
Okay, sir. Okay, sir. Anusmita Roy, she asked a question. Thank you, sir, for this informative session. My question is, by using these printed marbled pages, what actually Stern wanted to convey? Please explain. One more question, sir. Does the empty blank page creates any satirical view? One of the critics, Victor Slowowski, told it is all according to law, like a painting by Picasso. So what is the significance, sir?
Right. Once again, the marble page is that page where Stern shows that every book is different. Every single copy of the book is a different text, therefore to be interpreted differently by different readers. So Stern is pointing out to differences of interpretation really that the book has to offer. One. Secondly, when Shklovsky is talking about the empty blank page, I repeat that he is talking about the way in which Stern is drawing in, the reader to fill in meaning with his interpretations. You see, when Picasso points La Damoiselle d'Avignon, he is pointing out to multiple perspectives through which the five women are seated. Therefore, what Shklovsky is also pointing out through Stern is the multiple perspectives through which Widow Wadman's picture will be filled in by the reader. You see, the point remains that how does one conceive character? Is it merely the author who determines character? Or does the reader also, in the process of reading, conceive of the character in his own way? You see, if you are a young reader, so, we all sort of, me included, I was a great fan, grew up with Harry Potter, for example. Now, when you read your Harry Potter, you actually dreamt of Harry Potter, conceived of him in your own way, right? I remember, in fact, I held a seminar on Harry Potter once where a young boy of class 7 actually came to that seminar with a scar drawn on his forehead. He was imagining himself as Harry Potter. But when you take a look at the film, for example, you have this one particular character as Harry Potter. Where your imagination goes for a toss, you actually have a definite figure there. What Stern is asking you, and what Shklovsky and Picasso and all great artists want you to do, is to exercise and give a free play to your imagination, right? You become part and parcel of that creative space. You create meaning, you also participate in this creative process. Now, you will have to go back to Roland Barthes once again. Go back today and read this essay on the death of the author, and you also read his essay on the various kinds of texts, and look at this term, scriptable text. Stern is trying to invite you to be part of the process of novel writing itself. He's saying, don't be a passive reader. Be a part with me in the process of creating the novel itself. Right? That is what the pages are all about, especially the blank page. Right? Okay, one more.
Sir, yes, sir. There is a question in YouTube. Sir, is the writer Tristan Shandy unable to present a straightforward story, or does he deliberately frustrate the reader? If the latter is true, what justification can there be for that?
Well, I think, the entire discussion was an attempt to answer that question. So yes, it is a deliberate ploy. And please remember that there is a distinction between Sterne and Tristram. Now, Tristram is the narrative persona, Sterne is the author. And the failure of Tristram to narrate his own experience properly is a very deliberate narrative strategy by Sterne, the author. And the entire project was, as I had suggested, to question notions of character, to question notions of time, to question notions of plot, and of course, philosophically, to question the ideas of system making that the novel does through the questioning of Locke, Hume, and the way in which the materiality of the text is also brought to the foreground. Right?
Now I request Dr. Aloj Chand Biswas to deliver the vote of thanks.
Okay, Dr. Amrit Sen, your today's lecture is highly inquisitive and thought-provoking. It is almost customary to offer vote of thanks at the end of such an enchanting session. On behalf of the Department of English, Kharagpur College, and the Department of EGRA, SSB College, I offer my heartfelt thanks to Dr. Amrit Sen for spending near about 2 hours time with his erudite lecture among us in spite of his own busy schedule. We are immensely benefited by your lecture, sir. Next, I extend my thanks to all the faculties, research scholars, and the students who have participated in today's lecture and who have been doing so all along since 17 June. Last but not least, I offer my thanks to Professor Jayanto Kumar Murmu, Professor Chinmay Mandal, Professor Pothik Pradhan, and others who have assisted and coordinated quite efficiently to organize this lecture smoothly and in a quite trouble-free way. Thanks to all.
Thank you. Thank you for providing me with this opportunity.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much, sir.